This is a tutorial on the United Nations, which is, shall we say, the primary body of international governance in existence today, and a highly controversial one. It's really the primary body of global governance in the sense that it has the widest membership. It is very prestigious to be a member. It's seen as a recognition by the international community. Any newly independent state wants to become a member of the United Nations for that reason. And it's been a very important body for diplomacy and affecting international law in the post-war era. Now, when I say affecting international law, it doesn't mean that resolutions taken in the General Assembly become international law. They're not binding for members. They're mostly advisory. But it still sets precedents, and particularly through the workings of the United Nations Security Council, and we'll go over that in a moment. So the principles for UN governance, the mission is really to prevent wars. It's based on the Westphalian concept of sovereignty, so that each state is self-governing and that other states should not have the right to interfere in those inner workings, and to prevent wars between sovereign states. And this has become a bit of a complexity over the years because states don't work like they did in 1948 when the United Nations was really sort of coming into its own. That was the year that the United Nations adopted the Declaration of Human Rights. So the UN is really based on two fundamental principles. The one is to protect state sovereignty so that wars between states don't happen, because that was the primary form of conflict in those days. They were just coming out of World War II, which was a war between states. And the principle of protecting human rights. Now, this is a problem because sometimes these clash. Very often since the creation of the United Nations, individual states have done internally bad things to their own citizens. That includes genocide and all sorts of human rights abuses. And traditionally, when these two principles have clashed, state sovereignty have taken precedence. So when the Vietnamese government intervened into Cambodia to stop the killing fields, it was the Vietnamese government that was condemned by the United Nations for violating the sovereignty of Cambodia, even though the action stopped a genocide. And that was in the 1970s. So it's not that long ago. Now, there have been some very important policy developments over the past couple of decades. Human security and responsibility to protect. Now, this has been designed to remove the focus from state security to individual humans. And the idea here is that states that provide human security to all its citizens, in such a situation, the risk for war, the risk for conflict goes down. The risk for great waves of refugees goes down. The second is the responsibility to protect, adopted in 2005. And the idea here is that a state can lose its right of non-intervention if it fails in its duty to protect its citizens. An example was the UN Security Resolution 1973 to establish a no-fly zone over Libya. This was when Gaddafi had started an all-out assault on his own population, basically. And it was the most radical implementation of this principle to date. It was also critiqued, which is why the principle has yet to be refined so that people will know exactly, lawmakers, diplomats will know exactly when to use it and when not to. So it's still a highly controversial principle, but it has changed how we think about sovereignty and how we think about what states actually can do to their own citizens. The United Nations Security Council is the only supranational body in the world with the power to implement force between states legally. It has 15 members, 10 temporary, 5 permanent. The 5 permanent members have a veto. So these are the UK, France, China, US, and Russia. They were the victorious powers in World War II. And the other 10 members are selected from different regions, as you can see on the map, and membership rotates. They do not have vetoes. There is critique against the United Nations Security Council. It needs to be effective in emergencies because that's the entire point of the council. But because it has a veto involved there, it means that it can't act if only one of the 5 says no. And that happens a lot, particularly now with Russia being more active. It is also unrepresentative. The Global North holds the most power, and the Global South needs better representation. But if it gets more members, it's going to get less effective, not more effective. And the P5, the permanent 5, those 5 with veto powers, are not really representative of the new world situation. So there are emerging powers like Germany, Japan, and Brazil, and India, and a lot of people argue that maybe they should have permanent representation. But if they get permanent representation, again, the efficiency of the Security Council will go down. So there's a bunch of suggestions for how to do this. Should we increase the number of permanent members by 5? Should we have more seats from Africa or the Middle East? But how to balance that without destroying, without further damaging the capacity of the Security Council to act, that's a big debate. So this has looked over the United Nations and its functionality in global governance.